Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Beat the Big Guys. I'm your host, Sandy Rosenthal, and today my guest hails from the great state of California, and I believe it is Sonoma. Do I have that right?
Actually, I'm from Sonoma County, but I live in the town of Sebastopol, which is a really tiny town.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm sorry about that, but you're still in California,
Yes, in Northern California.
in Northern California. And thank you so much for joining us. I'm embarrassed. My guest, I forgot to make sure on how to pronounce the name before we started recording. So why don't you tell everybody how to pronounce your name, please?
Oh, my name is Iris Jamahl Dunkle.
Dunkle. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I would have said Dunkly.
Yes, it's Dunkel like dark in German.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much, and for explaining how to pronounce your name. I'm thrilled to have you on my show because you and I are actually kindred. We both are lucky enough, or unlucky enough, to have had a book get published or come out, debut. Right in the beginning of COVID, in the year of 2020. So we have a
Yes.
connection there. Um, I'm sure you like we hate to complain. We survived, and we're here and we're well, and we hate to complain, but it was unlucky having a book come out the first year of COVID, when it was all very frightening and scary, and we didn't really understand how it was transmitted.
Exactly. And very few people knew how to, promote books online, which was the only way that we could do so.
It was the only way, and we had to figure it out. Iris, your book came out in just a little bit after mine, in September of 2020.
That's correct.
Great. Well, congratulations, and I look forward to hearing more about it. I'm going to just tell our listeners just a little bit more about you before we get started.
Sure.
Okay. Iris Jamahl Dunkle is an award winning literary biographer and poet. Her books include the biography Charminian Kittredge London, trailblazer, author, adventurer with the University of Oklahoma Press, and her fourth poetry collection, West Fire Archive, the Center for Literary Publishing 2021. Iris is currently writing a biography about the author Sonora Babb, which will be published by the University of California Press in 2024. Congratulations on that. So Iris, please
Yeah.
talk to us about one of the book that came out in 2020, about Carmian Kittredge London, because that story is very much all about how to beat the big guys,
Definitely.
and I think our listeners are going to find it really fascinating. And please go ahead and tell us your story.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me, Sandy. It's wonderful to be here. It's been wonderful to hear about the work that you're doing. Um,
Thank you.
I I came across Charmian actually without knowing it at a very young age. So I grew up in Sonoma County, and I always wanted to be a writer. But I didn't know that was a job you could have. And so I ended up going on a field trip to Jack London State Historic Park in Glen Ellen. And get there, they had all these displays with Jack London as a writer, and I fell in love with Jack London, not knowing that on that day I also met his wife, Charmian Kittredge London, who was also a writer, but who was not represented at all in the museum as a writer. And so I went to college, I went to, grad school, started studying literature, got my PhD, came back to Sonoma County and started working as a professor in Napa, and started volunteering at the park. And at that time, I discovered the books of Charmian Kittredge London, which included a biography of her husband called The Book of Jack London. And when I read that book, I was like, oh, she's actually a really interesting writer. She also wrote a book called The Snark, which was about their travels around the South Seas, and two books about Hawaii, their travels there. Um, and so once I read her, I started to ask questions like, why is it we don't know anything about Charmian Kittredge London? And I discovered this photograph of Charmian on a hilltop. It's called Sonoma Mountain, and it's a picture of Jack London on Sonoma Mountain on horseback. And I had saw that it had been attributed to Charmian, And so I sent it to a scholar who actually wrote, he's a wonderful scholar, Earl Labor, who wrote the most important biography on Jack London, the most recent one. And I sent it to him because it's his cover art. And I said, "Did you know that Charmian took this photo?" And he said, "Huh, no, I never thought to ask that. I never thought to ask who took that photograph." And I thought, wow, what else do we not know about Jack London's life because we haven't looked at Charmian because she's kind of been erased from this entire story. And so that's how I began writing biography, is because I wanted to answer that question. It was really important to me to know who this woman was that had kind of been erased from Jack London's story. And so I stumbled across the story of why she was erased. And it's how I decided to begin my biography, Charmian Kittredge London, trailblazer, author, adventurer. It's an event where Charmian is in her 60s at this point and living at Jack London Ranch. Jack London died many decades before, and she's living there trying to maintain his legacy, trying to maintain the ranch. And she gets into this horrible horse accident where she almost dies. And while she's in this vulnerable state, she gets a visit from Irving Stone, who is a young biographer in his 30s who adores Jack London and really wants to write a biography about Jack London. And she thinks this is great. He's a really popular biographer and known for writing a biography on Vincent van Gogh, and which is that family was also upset with. But he basically seduced Charmian. He came to the ranch, took her out dancing, said he was madly in love with her, and got her to sign away her rights to not only Jack's story, but to also her own story. And so when he ended up writing his book, Sailor on Horseback, which is now labeled a fictional biography, he published all of these untruths about her. He made her look like she was this airhead who really hindered her husband's career more than helped it. And she was so upset by what this portrayal, and also his portrayal of Jack as this like drunkard who womanized. And I mean, Jack London was an interesting guy, but what she was most upset about was how he had portrayed her. And so what she did was she burned a bunch of her documents, and then she locked up the rest of her documents at the Huntington Library, not knowingly, unknowingly kind of locking in this story of her life for the next 80 years.
Wow.
And so when I came upon the story, I was really lucky that those papers were now available to me at the Huntington Library. And so what I did was I started 6 years of research, really trying to uncover who this woman was. And it turns out she was a brilliant woman. She was college educated, unlike Jack London. She traveled the world and wrote about it. Her family came from, they came over on the Overland Trail, her mother's side of the family. Her father came over in the gold rush. And they were, entrepreneurs who had hotels up and down the state. And her mother was this incredible writer who was published in national magazines. And we know about her because Charmian saved her documents. And so over the next 6 years, as I'm going to the Huntington Library, as you would imagine, as somebody who grew up really in love with this story of Jack London, right? Because it made me want to become a writer. It was really when I read Charmian's diaries, which are all available, not all of them, but a lot are available at the Huntington Library. It was a real emotional experience, right? I'm sure you've felt this when you encounter a woman's story that's been erased or been squashed or changed in some way. You get mad, right? You get really mad. And so as a way to process that, I'm a poet first. And so what I did was I wrote a book of poems about these documents, like interacting with them and kind of the falsity of what our story of Jack London was. And so in it, I erased Jack London's name and just made him he or him. And these poems really kind of are lyric representations of Charmian's story. And it's in my book, Westfire Archive, which came out in 2021. But after I did that kind of, work, I was able to really uncover the story of Charmian, which was one of a woman that was writing for Sunset Magazine when she first met Jack London. She wrote a story about him for Sunset Magazine. This is not the person. She worked at one of the biggest shipping firms in San Francisco, had a woman who, reported to her. She had a high salary, had a maid that cleaned her house. And, she was an established 30-year-old woman when she met Jack London. And she met him at the Ferry Building. Like that's where her aunt set up this visit. And it's at this visit that, she was like, who is this Jack London character? Because he looked like a sailor. He's younger than her. And he's just, she was not impressed with him. But there was something about their interaction and how he respected her intellectually almost immediately. And she was deeply attracted to that. So at the Ferry Building, at their first meeting, they're at a restaurant, and they immediately fell intellectually in love. And it took several years, but eventually they were married. And she was immediately his writing partner, even before they were married. So she helped write many of his greatest books, starting with The Sea Wolf, which was one of his early masterpieces after The Call of the Wild. She was there with him, typing up pages, interacting with him about, rearranging ideas. It wasn't like she was just a secretary, as she'd been, really, most people had framed her as Jack London's secretary, right? And that's not what she was. She actually had an intellectual stake in their production. And by the time in 1912, when he was writing The Valley of the Moon, Charmian wrote huge excerpts of that book. And it was really important for me as a researcher and as a person to find that out, because no one had ever really written about that before. I looked everywhere. How could I be the first person to find this fact? But I wasn't. I was, and it turns out that book was one of my favorite Jack London books, and the reason why is because it had strong female protagonists, right? And I was like, oh, Jack London is so good at writing women. Turns out he wasn't. Turns out Charmian was, right? So it was really a fascinating discovery. And when my book was finally published, as you know, during COVID, it was the park really embraced my scholarship, which I was really grateful for. That's Jack London State Park in Glen Ellen. And that's a very museum that I visited as a young child. So I got to launch the book in that same museum. Only at the time that I launched it, they had redone the exhibit based on my book, and they made it into the Trailblazer exhibit. And that meant that the house where the museum is the house that Charmian lived in after Jack's death. So it's her house. It's called the House with Happy Walls. And on the second floor was her writing study, her bedroom, her own little kitchen, right? And that space has been turned into this exhibit that is just about Charmian's life, that is actually puts her forward as a writer. And so in this space where now little girls like me will go on field trips and they'll finally see a female writer showcased there, right? They'll meet two writers when they go to the park. And so it was really a wonderful experience. And it really set me off on this journey, which is now my life's work, is writing biographies about women that have been forgotten or misremembered in some way. So my next biography, which is nearing completion, which will be out in next fall from University of California Press. It's about a woman named Sonora Babb, and she was a woman who grew up in very poor in Oklahoma and eastern Colorado and around the Panhandle area. Her father was a gambler, and so they moved around a lot. She lived in a dugout, right? She on the eastern in eastern Colorado, and she ended up she went to LA and became a writer, and she worked in the fields in California for the FSA, taking down the stories of the victims of the Dust Bowl. And I had discovered her because my grandmother was came over during the Dust Bowl, and I had been looking for books about the Dust Bowl that were different from The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. So it turns out that Sonora Babb wrote this amazing book about the Dust Bowl called Whose Names Are Unknown in 1939. It was under contract with Random House. However, she was flown to New York. She left the fields, went to New York. She took the train to New York. And while she was there, Random House, the Grapes of Wrath came out 3 weeks before her book was published.
Ah.
And so Random House took her into the office, and she went into the office, and on Bennett Cerf's desk was just a check. And she's like, oh no, what's this about? Turns out that they canceled her contract because there couldn't be two books about the Dust Bowl, especially because two were so similar. They were so similar. But do you know why they were so similar, Sandy?
No, why?
Because he had borrowed her notes.
Oh,
He went on the road. You know, I don't know if you know, but the Grapes of Wrath is dedicated to Tom Collins. Tom Collins was her boss, and so she had been doing all these notes and setting up this information for, you know, and shared it. They had lunch. She had lunch with Steinbeck, shared the information with him, and he used it when he wrote the Grapes of Wrath. They approach the stories very differently, but there's similar events that happen. Hers is more focused on women and families, and, you know, really what it was like to live in Oklahoma before the actual event, the worst day of their lives happened, where they had to leave everything and come to
right.
California. So you get to know them and understand them. But then, you know, Steinbeck's portrayal is completely different, right? So her book didn't actually get published. Whose Names Are Unknown, which is also from University of Oklahoma Press, was not published until she was on her deathbed in the early 2000s. And thankfully, it did get published, and you can read it. But that's because a lot of people put a lot of hard work into getting that story published.
So I'm sure the listeners are wondering the same thing I am right now. How many books written in the 20th century or sooner were actually written by women?
So many, Sandy, so
So
many.
many, not all of
Yeah.
them, but a lot of them. And I did read Grapes of Wrath. No, I didn't notice that about the dedication. I definitely read Grapes of Wrath, and I'm going to have to read the other Grapes of Wrath. What's the title?
It's called Whose Names Are Unknown,
Whose
which
names
is
are
almost
unknown. What a
ironic.
good
Yeah.
title.
Yeah.
Wow, this is I'm mad, but like the old saying goes, it's better to know, you know.
Yeah.
It's better
Yeah.
to
And now
know,
you get to
even though I
learn
feel
about,
mad right now. So,
yeah. And now you get to learn about Sonora, right? And you
wow.
get to learn about
So
Charmian.
so you touched on a lot of things, and I hope we have enough time to get to everything. But one of the things that you mentioned was you were lucky that you found that documentation, and you were there. Definitely a luck element, but it's also when hard work meets the luck. I mean, you were looking for it. It didn't just fall in your lap one day sitting in your house. And that's one of the things that's really critically important when you're trying to work with the big guys is you will get lucky. You will discover a trove of important material, and it's going to be when you least expect it. But you do have to keep your eyes open and be looking for it. It's there. I can count on two hands the number of times that in my quest to beat the big guys that I've come across an incredible trove of information, but it was that had a luck element, but not really, because I'm always my eyes were open and looking and
Yeah.
looking underneath things and behind things.
Yeah.
Sometimes as simple as to get a random email from someone, thought you might be interested in this, and that's kind of annoying when people do that, because they'll say something like, read this book. And I'm like, I don't have time to read a book, but I opened up the link and it turns up it was an incredibly important piece of data. It's a good thing I clicked the link. So
Yeah.
it's luck, but it's not. And fear not, all you people out there, you will have some good luck in your
Definitely.
quest to beat the big guys. You will, and it comes from that quest. And the other thing is documentation. And so aren't you glad now, Iris, that Charmian loved to document and that
Yeah.
she hit all the paperwork? You see, if more people did that, we would know so much more about our history. I am convinced that Van Gogh, isn't he the one that cut off his ear? Uh,
Well, that's what Irving Stone said.
okay, but he isn't he the one that did the irises and it was
Yes,
wrote a lot of letters to his sister. Okay,
yes. To
I'm
to Theo,
convinced
his brother.
I'm convinced that the reason that he is so popular now as an artist, yes, he's talented. Incredibly talented. But the reason he's so popular and well known is because he wrote letters to his sister every week and she kept them all.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so every single painting he's ever done, we have documentation on what he was going through his mind when he was writing that painting, which makes him interesting, which makes him interesting to people, which means he's very, very popular.
And just to respond to that, I think what's really important about that is we have a woman's perspective in that story as
Yes.
well. And
Yes.
because if you think about the word archive, is what's saved by the conqueror, right? That's what it means in ancient Greek. So it's the idea of the archive is created by the people in power. So the idea that if we just look at the record, right? If I just grew up reading Jack London and not asking questions, not looking at it from a different perspective, not challenging the archive, I would have never seen her story. But it's exactly what you said, Sandy, that idea of putting yourself in a situation where you start to see these little nuggets of information that they start to create a new narrative that you would have never seen before.
And all you
And
have to do is look.
exactly. And if you look at the places, like if you look at, for example, if you look at Charmian's death certificate, the information is incorrect because at the
Wow.
time she had dementia and the people taking care of her did not know all of her details. And so the reality is like even documents that you were like, oh, well, that's a public document. That has to be real. They're not, and you have to look at things from like you said, so many different angles
Mhm.
to try to find the truth of people who have been erased. And I think it's so exciting. It's like being on CSI or something, right? You get to
Yeah.
like
Mhm.
discover the story that was hidden from the world.
There's a remarkable amount of information right there. You just have to go look. I can't tell you how much time I've spent in dusty file cabinets, getting my hands literally dusty, or going to the library in downtown New Orleans, looking through the archives. But that's where this data is. You have to look, but it's there, and it is incredibly important and incredibly valuable. And often, it's the secret or the answer to what you've been looking for. But you have to look.
Exactly.
But it's fun. It's fun,
It's so fun. I
exciting.
think it's fun.
So I noticed that I sat up straight when you said you referred to Jack London as he or him in your book. Well, and I did something very similar. You and I have both done something similar. When I wrote the book Words Whispered in Water, I want the world to know that the devastation and death and destruction that we had in 2005 was not due to weather. It was
Yeah.
due to men's mistakes.
Hmm.
Very specific people made mistakes. And so in my entire book, all 300 pages, I never once used the word Katrina.
Wow.
Okay. And it was just, I thought it was being sticky, but I said, no, I'm going to do this. I'm not going to say that word. And the whole, and you can check, somebody double proofed it for me. I never used the word because I want people to stop thinking about a hurricane. I want them to think about an engineering disaster. And I
Yeah.
sat up straight when I said, you said, use the word he and him. And I think that was clever. I think that was a really good idea.
I love that. I love that you use the same kind of process as a way to kind of shift your reader's mind, right? You have to like
Right.
change that narrative in their minds.
Oh man, I can't read my own handwriting here. I had a note to ask you. Oh, I just understood what I wrote. The book Memoirs of a Geisha. Iris, have
Mhm.
you read that book?
I have, yes.
It's remarkable that it's written by a man,
Hmm.
because it's certainly. I swear I'm reading the writing of a woman. So I have a question for you. Do you think that was really written by a man? That book? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I couldn't answer without doing a lot of research.
Hmm.
But
But it
the
certainly has a feminine
yeah,
viewpoint.
I mean, what you find a lot of times when you look at books like that, like another one of my favorite books is by Wallace Stegner. called Angle of Repose. And it turns out he also used a woman's text inside of his book without her permission as a way to, and part of the reason why I was so drawn to it are these like female characters that were so well written. And it's time, growing up in the 70s and 80s in California and being drawn to Western literature, there weren't a lot of examples of strong female protagonists, which feels really strange in the West, where all the women I know are strong and, capable women that, especially if you were in the early days of the Western United States, you would have had to be all hands on deck, right? You couldn't just, it wasn't like the women were just sitting around like, oh, I hope the men solve this problem for us.
Well, whoever the author of Memoirs of a Geisha, if you're out there listening, I've just paid you, and you wrote every word yourself. I've just paid you a big compliment. I didn't meant no disrespect at all, but I just can't. Again, I can't help thinking to myself how many books out there have women have partially with them or completely with them, and got no credit for it.
And I think the way you're thinking about it, Sandy, I think that's the most important thing is like if we go into looking at literature in a different way like that, like, I wonder why this female character is so believable. Maybe I should research it and to try to better understand were there women that helped him write this book or, like just thinking about everything in that way, right? That's probably how you think about research as well is like, okay, that sounds like an interesting story, but let's look at the other sides of it in order to figure out the whole truth, right?
Right, right. Well, thank you so much for showcasing, a true, wonderful, fabulous woman in our history that we're learning about only now. She deserves to be showcased. Your work needs to be showcased, and you should be showcased.
Thank you.
So, is there anything else that you'd like to add for our listeners? We've about run out of time.
Yeah, I just want to kind of like rally the troops. I think, the work that you and I are doing is, you know, limited to our lifetimes, right? And limited to how much work that someone can do as an individual. Um, but if we connect to other people and really get them to start thinking about history in the same way, to start thinking about asking questions when they look at it and finding the hidden stories within history that we haven't found. I always, I'm a teacher, so always at the end, I'm a professor at UC Davis. And so I always want to kind of rally the troops at the end. But the idea is that it's important that we start asking questions about our history. And it's something that's begun, but it's something that can never end because we'll really never know the whole truth. And we should never be satisfied with the history that we're given. When I was growing up in Sonoma County, in my classroom, I was told, in elementary school, I was told there were no more Coast Miwok or Pomo people. Those are the indigenous people from the area where I live. And I looked around, and in my classroom, there were Pomo and indigenous people. And I was like, what? Like, that's the first time I was like, I guess you can't really trust what you're being told all the time. So I just encourage everyone to kind of think about history in that way as something that's this like revisable idea that can always be more inclusive of more stories. And it's our job to question, and it's really fun to do so.
Words to live by. Thank you so much, Iris.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure, Sandy. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. And to all of you listeners out there, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to like, subscribe, and rate this podcast on all of your favorite platforms. Oh, I almost forgot. If you're into videos, you can watch the video version of this episode on my Beat the Big Guys channel of my YouTube channel. On my Beat the Big Guys playlist. Boy, I really messed that one up. So thank you all, and don't forget, no matter who you are, you too can beat the big guys.